you. Move this a little closer to me. Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming. It is a total pleasure and honor to be interviewing Jeannette today. We share an editor, which we haven't discussed,
Yes.
the great Nan Graham, but we've never met, and so this is
Yes.
thrilling.
This is our first face-to-face.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I want to apologize ahead of time. I was sick about 6 weeks ago, and my voice is a little wonky. Hopefully, it won't totally go out on me today, but I'll do the best I can. So, this book is fantastic, and as soon as you leave here, you will turn around and go right over there and buy it. I feel like, when I started thinking about asking you questions, I had all these adjectives that, I never use coming into. I was like, it's a barn burner, it's rollicking, it's twisty and turny, and it's all of those things which, will keep you up at night and turning the pages. It really is all of those things. I think the obvious place to start is to ask you about, I feel like this, at least I've heard you say, that this is of your 3 novels, yes? This one is sort of the most fictional, yes? The furthest afield from your deep, although you are very present in this book.
Yes. First, I'd like to thank everybody for coming, and I'd really like to thank Al Styron for interviewing. She is so. If you haven't read her books, you must. I feel like the stars interviewing the moon here. So, she's just a brilliant thinker and writer, and I'm genuinely honored. I'm also honored that y'all chose this beautiful day to sit under a tent and listen to my white trash stories. But. Yes, this is my most fictional book. I thought I would never write fiction. When I was growing up, both of my parents were writers, but they never sold anything. And when I found out that you could make a living writing true things, I thought, why would you write this made-up stuff? And I wanted nothing more than to be a journalist in New York City. So I moved to New York City, and I got a job pretty quickly. This will take a minute, so bear with me. I'm gonna go on
That's
a little.
why we're here,
I'm going on a journey here. I'm gonna take y'all with me here. But I got a job pretty quickly, and I was like, this is great. And I wanted to write about poverty and stuff like that. For whatever reason, I ended up writing about celebrities. It was just a weird thing. But I befriended a kind of a well-to-do man at the magazine I worked at. I didn't have a lot of friends because I worked really hard. And this gentleman, he asked me one day, he said, there's something about you that doesn't add up, Jeannette. And whenever I ask you about yourself, you change the topic. And why is that? So I changed the topic. And he said, well, that's it. If you won't talk about yourself, we can't really be friends because friendship's about trust. So I swore him to secrecy and everything, and I told him about my past. And his first reaction was, that would make a great book. So I married him. And he pulled it out of me. He pulled it, and I was a mess. I'll be honest. I was like, I thought once people knew the truth about me, I was going to lose everything. I was going to lose this fabulous job that I had. I had an apartment with a flush toilet, honey. Life is good, But I thought I'd be held in contempt, and the opposite happened. It was a very strange thing, telling your story. Truth is contagious. Honesty is contagious. And I thought I'd get fired from my job. Instead, I'm back on the red carpet asking penetrating questions. Who designed your outfit and stuff like that on the red carpet? And I was on the red carpet interviewing a well-known woman whose name I will not mention. She asked me to turn off the microphone. She said, I want to thank you for telling your story. My father's also a raging alcoholic, and I bought your book for friends who do not understand how you could love somebody who does such horrible things. And I thought, dang it, I can't write anything mean about this person again. So I didn't get fired, but I got defanged. And I had a problem because I have one slim little talent in this world. I'm really nosy, and I love people's stories. So I didn't know what to do. And my husband suggested we should move to Virginia. We brought my mom with me. She was homeless at the time. She didn't move in with us because I'm not a saint. We put her out back. And I started touring on behalf of the Glass Castle. And people, and this is why I love talking to readers. They're a lot smarter than I am. They're like, I understand your dad. I understand alcoholism. Your mom's a mystery to me. Why would somebody with a college education choose the life she chose? And I was like, well, because she's, kind of nutty. But so many people asked me, I was like, well, maybe there's a story there. So I asked Mom. I didn't invite her to live with us for the purpose of exploiting her, but as long as she's there, what the heck? So I said, Ma, how would you feel about my writing your story? And she was the one who said it shouldn't be about her, but rather about her mother, my grandma Lily, who was a tough broad, a gun-toting, hooch-selling, horse-breaking school teacher. And she didn't just drive she didn't just school teach, she drove the school bus, which wasn't a school bus. It was a hearse with the word school bus painted on the side. And it was all the time getting stuck in the mud. And she'd get the students out and make them recite Hail Marys while they pushed. And she'd say, push and pray, kids, push and pray. It's become a little bit of a philosophy of life for me. So I thought, I'm finished with all this writing stuff, but then I wrote I called that book, it was Half Broke Horses, but I called it fiction because it was all from my mom. I have no idea how much is true. And I had to fill in these gaps that I didn't know what happened, or mom didn't know what happened. And it was funny because people in publishing kept saying, oh, well, you can call it nonfiction. It's like, no, I'm sorry, you make something up. It's not like, oh, mostly true. No, I'm sorry, no. And people have asked me, well, how true is the glass castle? No, you do not make this stuff up, okay? You do. There's a bond between the writer and the reader. And you're telling, this is how I survived poverty, or this is how I survived drug addiction, or whatever. And you have to be honest. If you don't have the honesty, forget it. Put the label fiction on it. So I wrote another book, Silver Star, again, based on people I knew. And I thought, I'm finished with this making up stuff. And still going on tour, though. And again, it was readers. And some that say, you should write fiction. I was like, no. I am a truth teller. I'm a fact finder. I do not make things up. I have no imagination. I am a reporter. That's all I do. And a gentleman in Ohio, first row, he raised his hand after I was going on about being a fact finder and having no imagination. He said, ma'am, forgive me, but I think you have a fabulous imagination, but you're afraid of your own creativity. I was like, oh, I think he might be onto something. Because both of my parents, wildly creative. You know, they had characters in their heads at all time. And sometimes the characters would get out at their behest, and sometimes not at their behest. And I think I associated creativity with, I think I associated making things up with lying and insanity, both of which run in my family. And I was on a panel one time with a couple of novelists, and the wonderful Elisa DeGenoa, who wrote Still Alice and a number of other books. Somebody asked her, what is the best fiction writing advice anybody ever gave you? And she said, take an acting class. And I thought, well, that's kind of weird and dumb. She doesn't know what she's talking about. And I didn't realize what she's talking about until they turned The Glass Castle into a movie. And Al and I were talking about this a little bit. She's done some acting. I'm really eager to talk to her about this because Woody Harrelson was cast as my father. When I first heard he was cast as Dad, I was like, well, that's stupid casting. He doesn't look anything like Dad, but nobody knows what Dad looks like, so that doesn't matter. And then he called me up, even before we'd met, and he was asking these really great questions about, like, and they were really direct, like when he talked to you, did he look you in the eye? And what did he do with his hands when he talked to you? And he wanted to get Dad's walk. And he felt if he could get the walk, he could get the personality. And I was just so fascinated. These actors, they have these extra nerve endings, and they're hypersensitive to the physicality of emotion. And he kept on trying to get Dad's walk. And so I'm clomping around my office trying to describe Dad's walk. And he could hear me clomping, and I was like, Dad had a kind of long-legged, lean-hipped walk. And he said, I don't know what that means. I said, because it doesn't mean nothing. And he said, I wish I could see you. And I said, oh, no, you don't. I look like RuPaul. You don't want you, because I can't do Dad's walk. I'm not an actor. But so I go to the set. I'm sorry, I will get to this in a minute. So I get to the set of The Glass Castle. He didn't know I was there on this particular day, what they were filming. And it's really interesting. Those of you not in the movie business, they always shoot the most complicated scene of the day first, so the actors have a lot of energy still. And on this particular day, they were shooting the scene where the Brie Larson character, that would be me, was going to leave home. And the Woody Harrelson character, my father, was trying to convince her to stay. And the first time I saw Woody Harrelson in character, I burst into tears. He nailed it, honey. He might be blue-eyed, blonde-haired, whatever, but he had the posture, he had the cigarette behind his ear, he had the friggin' facial muscles. I was like, how did he do this? And so they were acting, and I was like, ugh. And then they went off script. And Woody Harrelson started saying things that my father had said that I hadn't told him. And I was a mess. I was slinging snot. I was all over the place. And Woody walks off, and he sees me over there. in the corner crying and looking a mess. And he didn't know I'd been watching it. He walks over, and in Dad's voice, I'm not such an idiot that I thought that was Dad, but I started apologizing. I'm sorry, I should have stayed at home, blah, blah. And he hugged me, and in Dad's voice, he says to me, "You had to do it, honey. You had to leave, or we wouldn't be here right now." And it was one of those miracles that life gives you sometimes, if you're really, really lucky. Here, this man who never met my father had embodied my dad to such an extent that he got the voice, he got the psychology, and he gave me this incredible gift of letting me apologize to him. And I thought, that's what this making up stuff is. I don't think that most fiction writers make things up. The sort of fiction that I'm drawn to is very close to nonfiction. And these actors, and I'd been studied one time when Jennifer Jason Leigh was playing a journalist. She spent some time with, they don't say, oh, well, I'm going to play a journalist and figure out what they study, they look, they do the research, they borrow from what they know. And if somebody told Woody Harrelson, just, play a drunken hillbilly, he would have resorted to stereotypes because that's what we know. But it's getting deeper, and it's getting inside people's heads. And it wasn't just, I have to say, it wasn't just Woody, it was Naomi Watts. Oh my God, I think she understood Mom better than I did. And they all inhabited these characters. And I thought, I will never be as good as they are, but they're kind of my North Star in making things up. I think in fiction, the really memorable things are not the plot. When you think about the greats, and I'm not talking about the recent greats, I'm talking about Dickens and Shakespeare, it's not the plots we remember, it's the characters. And if you can bring these characters to life and make them, don't be like Scrooge, these characters have become part of our psyche. And if the writer has the capacity to bring this character to life and make you feel that you know this person and root for them, and the good and the bad intertwined. I know an actor who's trying to play an evil person, and he went to his director and he said, "This person's just so bad, I don't know how to play it, he's just so evil." And the director said, "Don't play the evil, play the hurt." And it's understanding people on that level. Yeah. So I think that in writing Hang the Moon, and again, I will never be Woody Harrelson or Brie Larson or lovely little Ella Anderson who played me at age 11. But that's kind of my North Star. That's my guiding light, to try to channel the characters and get inside their heads to the degree that I would know what they would say in a given situation.
So, this book took you a long time. I mean, by my standards, not a long time. But by sort of traditional fiction writing, someone who turns out a book every 2 or 3 years, this book took you a long time. And as I understand, many drafts.
Many drafts, yeah.
And why is that, do you think?
It's set 100 years ago. So I think that, as I was alluding to, I think that acting is a process of empathy, and so is fiction writing. And I'm not of the school that says you cannot write about somebody. I cannot write about somebody whose gender I don't share, or race, or whatever. I think you can go outside your demographic, but you got to get it right. You got to get it right. And so I was obsessive about researching. And this book is set 100 years ago. So trying to get inside the head of somebody who lived 100 years ago, I felt I had to. I thought, I'll go read a diary of a moonshiner. They weren't keeping a lot of diaries. There wasn't, Little Still on the Prairie. It wasn't out there. So, I found, a lot of the, it's a fascinating period, Prohibition. But we have these incredible iconic figures from Prohibition, but they're mostly urban. And you got the Untouchables and the Elliot Ness and the Al Capones and all that. And what do we hillbillies have? We have Snuffy Smith of Hoot and Holler, and I just wanted to get a little bit deeper in who were these people and what was really motivating. And there wasn't a lot of research. There wasn't a lot of material for me to turn to. And mostly I went to newspapers, the local newspapers, and I read a lot of letters from the period and editorials. And it was kind of funny because, we look back at Prohibition and what a mess, but reading editorials and speeches from the time, there's a lot of good arguments for Prohibition, and there's not a lot of good arguments for liquor. People should be allowed to spend their money on something that makes them lose their IQ points. But I wanted to get inside. So there's the whole technical issue about how is this done? How did this happen? What did moonshine cost? Again, that was a bit of a challenge because it wasn't static. And so again, I returned to my old friend research. And the book is set in rural Virginia 100 years ago. And after Prohibition failed, there was a study, what the heck went wrong? And it was revealed that there was a county in Virginia, Franklin County. It was called the wettest county in the world. And an estimated 99% of the residents there were involved in moonshine making or distribution. And there was a big trial, so I used the transcripts from that for a lot of the research, and also for the language. It was really interesting. And I wanted to make the book kind of colloquial. And a lot of the slang and colloquial that we use, it was innovated during the 20s. So every word, every phrase, gussied up a 1930s word. I wanted to say that somebody had the balls. I found this lovely resource, Green's Dictionary of Slang, which tells you when various curse words entered the lexicon and where. And originally, my main character, Sally, she was a real potty mouth, and her go-to curse word was my go-to curse word, which is dumbass. And she was all the time talking, excuse my language here, y'all. But so she's always calling prohibition a dumbass law. And then Green's Dictionary of Slang revealed to me that dumbass is a mid-century curse word. A lot of the curse words, it was a GI slang, so I had to lose all my dumbasses, which broke my heart. But it felt a little bit more authentic afterwards. But so in this researching this trial in Virginia that happened after Prohibition had failed, I'm sure you all know the way that moonshine was run was there'd be these caravans. And the most difficult and dangerous position was the pilot, who's in the front. And the pilot would head off lawmakers and revenue people coming in, and somebody came in from the back, they would fall back and head them off that way. And the fiercest, fastest moonshine runner pilot in Franklin County was a woman. And her name was Willie Carter Sharp. And there wasn't a whole lot written about her. I looked high and low, and I don't think she had a happy ending. Sherwood Anderson wrote something about her, but it was completely made up. But I didn't want to put anything in the book that couldn't have happened in real life. I don't know about y'all, but if I read something said 100 years ago and they start talking or sounding or thinking like present day, then forget it. Or you think this wouldn't have happened then. So I based a lot of the characters on historical characters, and I tried to get the language and everything right. So that's what took me so long. And unfortunately, I find everything fascinating. And I spent a day researching. I had something with an orange. Can I make it a navel orange? And in fact, navel oranges had just been invented. Yeah. And I had what I thought was a fascinating couple of pages on the history of navel oranges. Fortunately for readers, my editor didn't find navel oranges fascinating and cut it out. But if anybody wants to discuss the history of navel oranges, I got a lot of research on it, and I'd be happy to share it with you.
I think John McPhee wrote a whole book about it.
You can. I mean, these things are interesting if if you get obsessive about it. And one of the characters is a baseball player, and I bought 3 books on early baseball. It was so interesting, and I ended up probably using. Well, I did use a little bit of the research, but it's just more to think, what were people thinking? And my editor, and she's brilliant, Nan Graham, brilliant, but a couple of times she said, you have to make the main character more sensitive to the less fortunate around her. And she has to be sensitive, but she can't sound like she just came from a Black Lives Matters meeting. So how do you walk that fine line? Because basically everybody was a raging racist, so how do you
Right.
How do you do that and make her sympathetic but true to the way that people were thinking and feeling?
Well, that's the great challenge of fiction writing, because often your characters are highly unsympathetic.
Yes.
But no one will keep reading and no one will keep watching if they don't seem human.
Right.
And I think that you've got these, I feel like you have these, there are sort of themes and tropes, like all good writers come back to things that interest them.
Right.
And there is this kind of feminist thread in your work, and there's almost, always a woman who kind of not only gets by, but triumphs on her wits.
Yeah.
And that's not always, she doesn't necessarily start out as the most sympathetic.
Yeah, she's a tough broad.
She's a tough broad.
Yeah, people say, you always write about tough women. I'm like, well, that's all I know. Tell you a quick story. Sally Kincaid was born into wealth, and then she was kind of booted from that. And I'm just a big believer in, I don't know, tell you all a quick story here. so I'd moved to New York City, and I was working. Nobody knew anything about my past. I was working at a kind of snooty magazine, and this kind of well-to-do woman, she wanted to go on vacation. Well, not kind of well-to-do. She had the houses in Switzerland and stuff like that, and she wanted to go on vacation with me. And so I thought, well, that'd be kind of interesting. What do rich people do on vacation? I'll go with you. What do you want to do? And she wanted to go to something called Outward Bound. Now, I'd never heard of this here Outward Bound thing before, and she explains to me that you pay a rather substantial amount of money, and you go out into the wilderness and you forage for food. And I'm thinking, honey, first 17 years of my life were in Outward Bound, you know? So I called my brother and said, you're not going to believe this. Rich people got to pay for their hardships, you know? And I thought it was just about the weirdest thing I'd ever heard until I got to know this woman better. And she's so strong and so resilient, but she doesn't know that. And so I had to give Sally her little Outward Bound. I had to give her like time out of this cushy life, whereas her brother, who she envied, got to stay with the father.
Yeah. And tell me, in reading some of your earlier interviews, there is a Tudor.
Oh.
There's a Tudor family that seems to be, which would never have occurred to me, but I'm curious to know where that.
Yeah, I don't talk about the Tudor connection in all. I've seen, a couple of times I've spoken, people, they hear Elizabeth first, and I see the wall go, the eyes close. But I'd always been fascinated by Elizabeth I. My mother and father would have these raging arguments about her because my mother hated her. She was like, she was selfish. She always wanted her own way. Everything was about me, me, me. And my father just adored her, said she's a tough woman who made it in a man's world and did what she had to do. And there was a price to pay, but she succeeded against all odds. And I love the story of this woman who everybody thought would be a nobody, who just, she did. She confounded everybody. And one time I was reading a biography of Elizabeth I, and all these cousins marrying each other and all these feuds going on and stuff like that. I was like, these people are kind of like white trash, aren't they? And I thought, hey, you could take the basic template and move it forward. And I was going to move it up into the 1980s or even the 21st century and make it media, which thank goodness I didn't, because everybody would have thought I was doing Succession.
Oh, yeah.
In fact, a couple of people have asked me if my book was inspired by Succession. A couple of people have asked me if it's inspired by the Trumps. And I think it just goes to show you it's a dynasty. It's sibling right. It's about family. For all the like moonshining and the shooting and all that, it's about family. And that's one of the things that just so fascinates me. Family and the dynamics and how two siblings growing up in the same household can come away with entirely different stories. Same facts, different stories.
Do you feel like that was the experience in your family?
Oh yeah. My very favorite memory of my entire childhood is when I was 5 years old, and we had no money for Christmas presents, and my father gave each of us children a star. I'm not subtle. I chose the brightest one, Venus, not a star, planet. Dad gave it to me anyway. He said, what the hell? It's Christmas. You want a planet, you got a planet. And it's my favorite gift ever. To this day, I'll see Venus up in the sky. I own that, honey. That is mine. And I love the story so much. I told it at my father's funeral. After I finished telling the story, my older sister, Lori, lots smarter than me, always saw right through Dad's BS. She folds her arms and said, isn't Nat like that sorry SOB dad of ours to go give away something that doesn't belong to him in the first place? And I thought about that a whole lot while I was writing The Glass Castle, because I am a big believer in truth and truth-telling. But, it depends on how you choose to tell the story. We are all storytellers. Anytime anybody answers the question, how was your day, what happened, you are telling the story. And what do you focus on? What do you do? You focus on the jerk who cut you off in traffic or the lovely clerk who you had a nice little chat with? So yeah, and you can have two siblings and they see the same parents, and one of them hates them, the other one loves them. Same country, some people see a jerk for a president, the other people see a hero. And we're seeing the same facts, we're seeing the same scenario, and you choose to focus on things differently. And again, I find that fascinating as somebody who prides myself in a truth teller, being a truth teller. And any journalist, any memoirist, any biographer, knows exactly what I'm talking about, because you choose which stories. Well, that one's not that interesting. I'm not going to tell that one.
Yeah.
And well, that one kind of unproves my theory. We'll ignore that one. So how do you tell your story? And you can tell the same story. My brother tells the same star story, a hilarious impersonation of my dad being drunk. So for one it's a comedy, the other it's a tragedy, for the other it's an inspiration. Same facts, different story.
I think your work, I think one of the reasons that The Glass Castle has been a bestseller for so long, and the reason people respond to it, is also because I think there's something about giving people permission to tell their version of their truth that really, I think, has moved so many people. As writers, it's a goal, certainly, as a memoir writer.
Yeah.
But it's very hard to do do well, whether or not you and your siblings agree that this is how things happen. I think people, and I think probably a lot of people here who have read The Glass Castle are probably find that one of the great, powerful aspects of your writing is everyone is kind of, as you've said, people move towards you when you tell the truth.
And it's been so beautiful for me because people feel safe with me and they tell me their stories. And some people have said, that just must be so weird, everybody knowing all this stuff about you. But it's been the opposite of weird, because I don't have to pretend, that I got a la-di-da background or anything. I used to think that the way to feel good about yourself was to feel superior to other people. I thought that was kind of my goal when I first moved to New York. I'm going to be a fancy dancy New Yorker and put on fancy clothes and all that. And I'd been living in New York for a little while. Decided to go back to this little town in southern West Virginia where I grew up, show them what a fancy dancy New Yorker I'd become. And I decided to go to this restaurant that would always been kind of too expensive for us Wallses to eat at. It was a coffee shop, but everything is relative. So I put on my fancy clothes and I sashay in thinking I'm all that, And I take a seat at a prominent booth. Waitress comes over, she's maybe 30-ish, but she looked like she had a kind of tough life. But I wasn't focused on her, I was focused on what she thought of me. So I was like, she hands me a menu and it says, special today, fish. And she comes over, she says, can I help you? I said, yeah, I knew from having eaten at fancy restaurants in New York, the waiter comes over and says, the special today is Chilean sea bass, whatever. So I said, what is the fish? Now, I was being a jerk because I knew darn good and well what the fish was. It wasn't a lovely Chilean sea bass. It was a little square piece of fish with breadcrumbs. It was fish sticks, which happens to be my favorite fish anyway. But I was trying to humiliate the waitress and saying, oh, this is a fancy restaurant. This is not a fancy restaurant like you're obviously used to eating at. This is a coffee shop, so that I could feel superior to her. So I said, what is the fish? And she said, excuse me? I said, the menu says special today fish. What is the fish? And she looked at me to see if she'd heard what I was just asking. And she looks around to see if anybody else had heard what I just asked. And then she says, kind of slow and careful so I can understand her, the fish is an animal which swims in the water. So, like I said, I was being a jerk, and I didn't feel any better about myself. Certainly didn't impress her. She's thinking, make them pretty dumb where you come from, huh? But if I wanted to feel good about myself, I should have introduced myself, and I might have made a friend. And that's one of the many things I've learned from having told my story, is that there are so many people out there with these stories. And it has changed the world for me from a place filled with potential adversaries, potential enemies, to a place with potential friends, and complete strangers come up. And they'll say, it's a lesson I keep on still learning. Sometimes I was in Dallas the other day, and there's this woman waiting to get a signature, and she's all Neiman Marcus'd out, and I'm like, ah. And she comes over and said, girlfriend, you and I could be sisters. She said, my daddy was a truck driver, my mama was a cocktail waitress. One day, daddy went out for cigarettes and never came back. And just don't jump to conclusions. Hatred is contagious, fear is contagious, but so is openness and honesty. And I think, and there's been so much discussion about how do we get the world together. I believe so passionately in the power of storytelling. You can cite statistics until the cows come home, but it's the stories that open up people's hearts and that make these connections. And and people come up to me, and sometimes their lives are so different. Sometimes they come from great wealth. I was at New York Magazine after The Glass Castle was published, and there was this woman, trust fund and all that, and I thought, for some reason, I thought she was going to hate The Glass Castle, and I was all prepared to be looked down at by her. And I was at a book party, not for the Glass Castle, but another one. She's across the room. She sees me. She comes running at me. True story, I clenched my fist. She might be rich, I'm tough. I could take her down. I thought she was going to spit on me. And instead, she throws her arms around me. She said, I want to thank you. I've been in a book club for 12 years. And it wasn't until we talked about your story that we got open about our own. And she said, you've inspired me to write my own memoir. And it was a beautiful, beautiful memoir. And it was very tough. Yeah. It was a very difficult childhood. Yeah. And you know, life is friggin' beautiful if you're willing to be honest about it, not put on airs, and reach out and are willing to be vulnerable and say, you know, I don't have all the answers either, but let's talk about the questions. And people, in my experience, are so good. And like I said, I thought the way to feel safe was to put on armor. The thing is, you know, you can fight with armor, but you can't accept the love. And it's storytelling, and so that's, and as important it is to tell your story, it's equally important to listen to other people's stories, at least as important. And again, that's, I think, one of the beauties of fiction. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I realized that at first. I was just like, the truth is the truth, and people say you can get closer to the truth with fiction. I'm not sure I believe that, but you can tell stories that otherwise wouldn't be told. Stories from the voices of people who cannot tell their own stories. I mean, when I was a kid, my first favorite book was Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which was probably a memoir, but it was marketed as fiction. But then it was The Grapes of Wrath. I thought, here's a family that would not look down at the walls. And it was fiction. It was highly reported, but it was fiction. And I think, you know, The Grapes of Wrath did so much to change people's opinions about those people. Those crazy migrant workers, who are they? It is humanizing people. And I think that is the power and the magic, the alchemy of storytelling, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, bringing people to life.
Well, I think you and I are an interesting study in contrast. Yes. Because we have the same editor. We have very, very different upbringings. But at the center of both of our stories are, you know, many similarities, and that's the thing that people respond to.
Yes.
I certainly felt the same way when I wrote my memoir. I thought, you know, how many people are going to be interested beyond my father's celebrity in what this story is? But I similarly had, you know, an enormous response from people whose lives were entirely different, who said, you know, I grew up, you know, my father was a plumber, but he struggled with depression and alcoholism, and he was a difficult father, and all of the things that bind us together. And that's why, you know, I mean, I think that's why The Glass Castle speaks to people, even though it may seem quite different.
That is why we tell our stories. Yeah. You know, I think that we memoirists get a little bit of a bum rap. People think that we're exhibitionists. Oh, these awful things happened to me. You got to feel sorry for me. And that's not it at all. It's looking for that commonality, that overlap. Because in reading her memoir, it's like, wow, we couldn't have had a more different life. But there are these weird parallels. Totally. And I just loved her desperately from having read it. It's like, this woman, like, you know, she thinks about the same things that I do. We come from, the backgrounds couldn't be more different, but it's finding that connection. And we're laying out our lives and saying, you know, this is my life, and maybe you can learn something from it without the nasty business of actually going through it. And then people open up about their experience, and we share. And, you know, The Glass Castle was banned in a very well-to-do suburb in Dallas. And one parent objected to it. And the other parents and the teachers, and God bless them, the students, all banded together and say, we need to know about people like this. We're so privileged, we're so well-to-do, we need to read about stories about poor people. And so they not only brought it back, they had it assigned reading, and they brought me to speak to them. And a friend of mine, a writer, said, oh, you're going to hate those kids. They're a bunch of spoiled brats. We had the best conversation. Oh, my gosh. We talked about everything under the sun, what parents owe kids, what kids owe parents, addiction, entitlement programs. It was an amazing conversation. But one student held back. And after the other kids were gone, this student came up and said, I want to thank you for telling your story, because my uncle also made an inappropriate move on me. And your story gave me the courage to go to my parents and talk about it. So we poor folk have not cornered the market on dysfunctional families. And I get it. I understand why people want to ban books and protect their kids. It's all like, how do we best make our kids safe? And my argument is we make them safe. My passion is that we make them safe not by isolating and insulating them, but by gently exposing them and giving them the tools to understand and protect themselves.
Yep.
Thank you. Thank you.
Tell me a little bit about who you like to read and who were sort of inspirations, particularly for this book. What?
I'm all over the place reader. My favorite book is always the one I'm reading at the moment. But I love history. I love memoirs. For this book, it was. You know, there were books on I mean, I read.
But the way this book moves is there are enormous plot twists and things you don't see coming. And
that was not inspired. I don't like to read highly stylized nonfiction or fiction while I'm writing. It influences. When I was writing The Glass Castle, I was reading Frank McCourt's Angela's Ashes, and I noticed Blarney was creeping into my wee little brother. It's like, I don't talk like this, so I have to be very careful what I read. And I read about 300 books for this, and way too much on the Tudors. I didn't need to know all that about the Tudors, but I went down so many rabbit holes on everything. I mean, words and styles, and I had all these wonderful. It was so interesting about cooking, because cooking was just kind of becoming a fancy thing because of electricity. So, I had all these neat menus, because 20 years earlier, they'd say, a cup of this, a pinch of that, and cook it at a high heat for about an hour. And then around the 1920s, because they had, stoves with controls, it was cook it at 220 degrees. Well, you can tell I'm not a chef, because nothing gets cooked at 20. But they had these and there was this recipe for tornadoes of beef. I just love that. I wanted to include that. And they put everything in Jell-O, and I wanted to include all that stuff, but I couldn't. I love anything that is just kind of honest. Whether it's fiction or nonfiction, somebody that tries to solve this blessed, beautiful mystery of the human being. What makes us tick? Why do we do what we do? And, sometimes they're great big old fat books, sometimes they're little, and anytime anybody's willing to be honest, and it is so interesting to me how fiction can get very close to that. I'm not going to say which one I believe gets closer, but I love reading. For all that my parents didn't give us kids, I cannot remember not knowing how to read. Our house was always filled with library books. Sometimes we returned them, but and we were not only reading at a very early age, but writing as well.
I think I want to open it up to, I know you have a lot of fans here and probably people who are excited to ask you questions. So we're not using mics.
Mics are in the aisles here. You can come up and ask your questions. Sorry, that would really help getting out.
I really enjoy Glass Castle, and I look forward to reading your new book.
Thank you.
Another author who's written about his experience with Appalachia is J.D. Vance.
Oh, yes.
And
yes.
I'm just curious as to whether you have any comments about his own writing and whether you've met him.
I said ask anything, and now
she did say that. Now she has to answer.
I didn't connect with that particular book. I was fascinated to read. It's like, oh, I'm going to love this. And I'm a very impatient reader. And if it doesn't get me in the first 30 pages, I'm on to the next one. And that one just didn't resonate with me. I kind of knew people like J.D. when I was growing up. I was like, oh, I know where he's going. I got this. And I didn't feel informed. And I'm sorry if there's J.D. Vance fans out there. I apologize.
Now we're going to get into a J.D. Vance conversation.
Yeah.
Were you disconcerted or offended by his sort of take on people of the mountains?
Not really. But I just didn't feel. I didn't feel that he was really being I felt he was kind of separating himself and saying, I'm different and I'm better. And that didn't offend me.
Yeah.
But it's just like, well, nobody's different and better. Nobody
Yeah.
is. That's, he's an ambitious man. It's funny because I've spoken to a number of friends from Appalachia about it, and they say, he wouldn't pour. He wouldn't pour, But that's not poor. You got a grandma who'll take care of you. You're lucky. But but he knew that it just didn't resonate. I'm sorry. Again, if you're a fan, my apologies. It just.
I wonder if you would comment on Demon Copperhead.
A comment on Demon Copperhead. I haven't. I've just started it, so I will not be setting it aside. I think so far it's quite brilliant, and she lives in the area, very compassionate. I think so far it's brilliant, and I think she's a brilliant woman, and cares deeply.
By the way, I loved A Tree Grows in Brooklyn.
Oh,
it was on my summer reading list. I'll have to go
yeah.
back and read it.
Yeah.
Yesterday, I went to the panel on Dynasty and Wealth, and you had a great quote about nostalgia and research. And if you could repeat it and maybe give us some examples, and then I'd love to know about flypaper.
Oh, the detail about flypaper is. I kept on reading all these articles about, like, they'd mention in come to our fly-proof hotel, or, we're doing a fly-proof bakery, or, there'd be all these committees for better roads, or the gardening committee, and the committee to prevent house flies. It's like, what is the darn issue with flies? Why are these people so obsessed with flies? So it's going to have a scene with flypaper in it, and find a site on the history of flypaper, and because I wanted to know if they had the little coils back then, or if it was just the double-sided, or what it was. And it said the use of flypaper declined greatly after the 1920s because of the advent of the car, because there was less horse manure.
Oh,
I'm like,
that makes perfect sense.
so this is why I love research, even though I
Yeah.
didn't use it. Like,
Yeah.
that's really interesting, and that's part of the whole thing about the cure for nostalgia is research. You forget how dirty everything was.
Yeah.
You also, the importance, and my editor kept on saying, you got to put in about the women getting the right to vote, and it was important, but the newspapers in that area in Virginia weren't covering it. What, in my opinion, really made the big difference for women's rights it was the automobile. It so changed people's lives. It gave them mobility. Because women themselves couldn't hitch up. Well, some of them could hitch up the wagon, but getting out of town or getting to town, it was extremely difficult. And the automobile, it changed so much. But you needed the good roads for that. And the number of articles about bad roads, especially up in the mountains, and it was all this whole question of isolation. So I thought I would love the 1920s. I've always had a thing about it, everybody's reading Gatsby and doing the Charleston and drinking from their flasks. And the casual racism and gleeful sexism, like racist jokes in the newspapers, and, jokes about women drivers, and just the hatred and ugliness that was just so transparent. At least we try to hide it sometimes. Some people don't try to hide it, but it was just the struggle of just keeping the house clean. It was so difficult. Yeah. Everything was difficult. Right. And it's very easy to back easier, simpler times. Prohibition was largely a nativist movement. One of the reasons I was drawn to the 20s in the first place is because it was such a transitional period. But with transition and change come fear. And the newspapers were just filled with articles about dusky people from the Mideast and stuff like that. And Prohibition was the Irish with their beer and the Italians with their wine. Let's go back to a simpler, better time. Sound familiar, folks? But there was just such hatred and fear and ugliness, a fear of the future. And, this happens whenever there's progress. And I think that this period is actually going to be looked at, the 2020s is going to be looked at nostalgically. I think people are going to look back and say, wow, look at all the amazing changes that happened in this period. We're living through it right now, so we don't see it clearly. But the rights that people are getting, yeah, and there's a lot of pushback, there's a lot of ugliness going on, but wow, I mean, I can remember, it's not, it's inconceivable, some of the rights we have now versus 20 years ago. I'm sorry, there's another question.
We'll repeat it.
When was the moment I decided to be a writer? I always wanted to be a writer from from a very, very early age. I loved storytelling. Like I said, I love everything. I'm fascinated by everything, and that was one of my problems. And so one of the reasons I was drawn to journalism is I thought, like, you can know everything, like, not necessarily deep, but like broad. You can like go do an article on the latest archaeological expedition, or you can do something on what's going on in space. I'm such a dip into all of this, so I thought like I can have a little taste of everything. And what happened is I was very unpopular in school. I was just like the outcast in school. But I got on the school newspaper, and I knew how to take photographs. So I could go to the dances, I could go to the football games. I had my camera. People started posing for me. I could put them in the newspaper, and I fell in love with journalism. I thought like, it gave me an entree into this world that I wasn't part of, as an observer and as in the sidelines. But I think a lot of writers and journalists, no matter how you grow up, we're observers. We're in the sidelines. So I love writing and reporting. I still love journalism. I don't miss finding out who Lindsay Lohan is really dating. But I do love this complicated process of trying to find the truth. Thank you for your question. Other questions?
Do you think you go back to nonfiction? Do you have a nonfiction book in your
I don't
quiver?
I don't think I will. I still love it, but the thing is, you can do anything in nonfiction. You can do anything in fiction that you can in nonfiction, and the reverse isn't true. So you can find a fascinating story, and it's not that the research is difficult. That's not what I find inhibiting, but you can take these fascinating parts of a story and put it together. And the challenge is that you have to make sure the pieces fit. And it can't be kind of a Frankenstein thing with too long arms. But John Cheever's daughter, I think it was Susan Cheever, said to one of her friends, "Don't say anything interesting around Dad because he'll put it in his books." and so that's what you can do as a fiction writer, like all these interesting stuff. Somebody, in your circle acts like a complete jerk. You don't get upset. You're like, "Oh, that would make a great scene." So, all of these things happen, and I think I've kind of fallen in love with that. That being said, I find it in some ways more difficult than nonfiction, because people say, "Oh, well, you've got to report it," but it's like navigating in an ocean. You can go in any direction.
Absolutely.
And you have to.
And do you find that you, not a rabbit hole, but you take your characters down in a direction and then find
that's the wrong direction?
Yeah, and
yeah.
well, then this whole other piece is not going to
absolutely.
match up. And nonfiction gives you guardrails.
Right, exactly. And you don't have to ask yourself about, well, these pieces don't fit up. And in fact, you talked about the Hang the Moon taking so long. It really wasn't working at first. And I put it in first person present. And something clicked.
That's interesting.
Something clicked. And also, I was focusing more on the business. And then I started focusing more on the women and the family. And it became more real. We got 5 minutes.
I was wondering, so I noticed a lot of similarities between you and Sally in the beginning of the book, especially, where you said you described her as having rusty red hair and her mother's strong jaw. And I was wondering how much you, found the similarities between yourself and the character to try to write her authentically.
Yeah, excellent question. The rusty red hair actually comes from Elizabeth, But yeah, I think, I'm not that good at channeling yet. I can't, I'm still turning to my go-to source, which is me. And there were a couple of times when I was stuck on the dialogue, and my husband and I would act it out. He would say, her father was the Duke, and he would be the Duke and say something, and I would respond and say he'd say, that's your line. So yeah, I mean, a lot of it did come from me, but a lot of it didn't.
Most fiction does. I mean, as you said, like acting, it all comes from, if you can't find a place of authenticity, even if you're creating a character who is completely different from you, if you can't find that center of authenticity, then it will read as inauthentic.
Right. It will feel made up. So,
Yeah.
But yeah, that's my character. Yeah.
Are we out of time?
I want to leave you all with one quick last
Please.
thought. Sally had she's one time. I know everybody thinks we're in dark times, but she's out in the dark at night, looking up at the stars, and she's thinking, the stars are there all day long. You just don't see them. And there are some things that you need the dark of night to see by their own light. And that's just something, please remember during dark times, that the stars are up there all the time. We just don't see them. So during these dark times, remember to see the stars. And thank you all so much.
That's beautiful, Jeannette. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.